Hi everybody, welcome to my presentation on non-conscious priming and its effect on help-seeking behaviour. This is presenting my master's dissertation as part of the MSc in Counselling at Bangor University. So the take-home message from this presentation I want you to take away is that future studies can harness real-world A/B testing methodology for experimenting with website and therapist profile design with the view to better supporting help-seeking behaviour, and that mental health websites and private practice therapists should consider more how their online presentation might impact clients' help seeking. And I hope that this presentation will make us understand more about why those take-home messages are important. So who is this relevant for? This is relevant for therapists considering how to market themselves online. And it's also relevant for online mental health services considering the acquisition and retention of people seeking help, particularly for those related to suicide support and prevention. So to introduce the field, I looked at four main areas of study that informed my dissertation. The first one is priming. So priming is eliciting a response or attempting to change someone's behaviour based on sort of putting in subtle environmental changes or stimuli to affect that behaviour. And then there's a theory called dual process theory, which says that the way that we process tasks can fall into two distinct categories. Implicit categories is about our effortless, quick associations, and it alludes to our implicit biases. Whereas explicit tasks look at the slower, deeper, reflective cognition that's usually in our conscious thought. And that looks more at the attitudes and beliefs that we have about things which inform our decision making. It's important when we consider sensitive contextual factors really that play into the priming stimuli and how it's always embedded within a larger context of people's experience. So the red ring here basically describes that this study that I've just conducted focuses on people's explicit tasks as opposed to their implicit behaviour, because we used questionnaires to elicit people's responses to the stimuli. So gender and priming. The research has recently told us that a lot of priming studies, or the majority of them, use predominantly female undergraduate population, and so it's difficult for us to make larger conclusions based on the wider population and how they might respond to priming stimuli. So Christoph and Moore and their colleagues created a really broad literature review that focused on the sort of social and evolutionary biological differences of gender and how our differences might feed into our differences in responses towards priming stimuli. And all of these references are in the description if you do want to research them any further. And if you want to ask any questions, then leave a comment below, or my website's at the top of the page. So the third one is gender and help-seeking behaviour. So the research is telling us that the rates of consultation are consistently lower in men, and that men seek help later in their illness comparatively to women. And that doesn't necessarily equate to men having less problems than women. It's just that their patterns of behaviour and the way in which they seek help tends to differ. It's an important point within the literature currently is that there's not enough known about within group variability. And that means that the way that which different types of men and women seek help may well differ, and that factors such as their age, their sexual orientation, and their culture or race may affect their help-seeking behaviour, and we don't yet know enough about that in order to draw conclusions. And finally, priming in psychotherapy. There's recently been 3 studies that have combined priming with elements of existing psychotherapy experiences. The first one is clay sculptures and using a sculptured task to manipulate how ready people feel towards making change in their lives. The second one is about word scrambling and using kind of word activities and embedding words that encourage people to disclose or to disclose less. And the third one is about using therapists' logos embedded within information booklets and sign-up sheets to increase their perceptions of empathy towards the therapist. And all three of these studies demonstrated that priming had a significant effect on the mechanisms of change that I've mentioned. So combining all four of these research areas, I generated the questions that I wanted to explore. The first one is, will embedding non-conscious priming into the therapist's online profiles influence participants' perceptions of the therapists and their attitudes towards help seeking? The second one is, will the gender of the therapist and the gender of the participant play a moderating role in the overall effect? And the third one is, will embedding priming stimuli into the therapist's online profiles affect participants' choice of therapists? And so how did I do this study? Well, it was an experimental between groups research design, and participants were undergraduate psychology students recruited through SONA, and the students were awarded credits for participating. And I adhered to the BACP and the BPS guidelines for ethical research, and it was approved through the university's Research Ethics Committee. So onto the design. So here you'll see the two priming stimuli that Marquise, Robbins and Moreau used for their study in 2018 using the logos in information sheets. On the top there you can see the positive empathy prime with two people looking in the same direction and sharing a perspective, and that was meant to elicit a sense of empathy. And below you can see two people that are not sharing the same perspective, they're looking in a different way, which was meant to elicit a sense of lack of empathy. And so I used these logos, but I embedded them within an online therapist profile, as you can see here. And this layout was typical of a layout that you see on online directories for therapists. And it's a fake profile that I generated using fake names and fake photos and fake descriptions. And so participants were assigned to one of four groups. And we had the female therapist with the empathy prime. We had the female therapist with the non-empathy prime. We had the male therapist with an empathy prime, and then a male therapist with a non-empathy prime. So once the participants were exposed and they read through the profile as if they were seeking to find a therapist, they answered a series of questionnaires, and then they also answered a series of qualitative questions about their experiences of the therapist and whether they would choose them, before seeing a debrief statement and finishing the study. So what were the results? So here you can see that 47 males participated and 144 females participated. So already we can see that this is replicating the same gender imbalance that is existing within the priming literature. But what you can see is that the gender distribution between each of the four priming groups are equal. And what that means is that we can draw conclusions based on within group variability. So in answer to each of the research questions, in answer to the first question, there was no significant differences in general help seeking questionnaire scores or the Barrett-Lennard relationship index scores when comparing empathy with non-empathy primes. And in answer to the question, will the gender of the therapist and the gender of the participant play a moderating role in the above effect? There was no significant interaction with the Barrett-Lennard relationship index. But when we look at these results further, the general help seeking questionnaire, it was split into two different parts. The first part was help seeking if you had a personal or an emotional problem. And in that instance, there was no significant interaction. Whereas when we looked at the second part of the general help seeking questionnaire, which was to do with if one had suicidal thoughts, there was a three-way interaction between the gender therapist, the gender participant, and the priming stimuli, and that was statistically significant. So what I decided to do was break down each of the participants into the female participants and the male participant population and re-look at the results. And here you can see that there's no significant interaction with the female participants when we look at gender priming stimuli and seeking help for suicidal thoughts. Whereas with the male participants, there was a significant interaction between therapist gender, priming stimuli, and help seeking for suicide thoughts. So let's have a look at the graph. Here you can see that the male suicidal thought score was highest with a combination of a female therapist and the empathy priming logo, and the lowest scores was just about a female therapist with non-empathy priming scores. What's interesting in this result is that the second highest score was actually a male therapist in combination with a non-empathy prime, which is an interesting thing to discuss. Will embedding priming stimuli into the therapist's online profiles affect participants' therapist choice? Now, I did a chi-square test based on the participants' answers to the question, would you choose this therapist? And the answers proved to be significant. So let's look at the graph again. So here you can see that the number of participants that said yes, they would choose the therapist was the most in combination of an empathy prime, and that also the amount of people that said no, they wouldn't choose a therapist was the most when there was a non-empathy prime, and that also that not having an empathy prime reduced the amount of people that would not choose the therapist. But there's a limitation in this research methodology, because when I designed the online questionnaire, I didn't give people the option to click yes or no. They typed in their results. And so some people used words like maybe, or probably not. And so I had to create a criteria for assigning yes or no to them, basically. So this is to be treated with caution. Discussion. So in terms of online mental health services, priming can affect male students' help seeking for suicidal thoughts. And so when creating websites and designs for logos and gender representation, these things should be considered. In the case of these results, representing female therapists on suicide websites for men could support an increase in users' help-seeking behaviours. When we look at considering therapists and how they market themselves online, the existing studies are working with a population of people that have already decided to seek help. It's during their initial session of psychotherapy. So it's about improving the client's experience. In this study, we looked at the acquisition of new clients. These are people that are considering whether or not to choose a therapist or to even see a therapist in the first place. And we can see tentatively that embedding priming within therapists' profiles can lead to an increase in decision to choose a therapist. Embedding the priming within the therapist's logo in the real world actually tells us more about the final decision-making process that goes on. Because actually, when you look at the journey of going onto a therapist's directory, you're often shown lots of therapists' profiles. And so at the point at which you've got to the full profile, you've already made a series of decisions. And so when we look back at the dual process theory, in the future it might be interesting to look at people's implicit tasks, and we could do that through measuring and looking at how people make decisions when they're faced with a directory of therapists, and whether or not embedding priming into people's thumbnail photos might affect their decision to click on one therapist over another. So when we look back at our take-home message again now, websites outside of the help-seeking industry use a methodology called A/B testing to increase websites' performance. And usually big websites, stuff like Facebook and YouTube, are constantly making micro adjustments and measuring the result changes based on how the users interact with the websites. So this presents a real-world methodology for experimenting with website and profile design to better support help-seeking behaviour, and it's something that could be adopted using priming stimuli to see whether or not it works. And likewise, mental health websites and private practice therapists should consider their online presentation and how it might impact the client's help-seeking. I really hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Do feel free to leave comments in this video or check out my website and get in touch with me there. It's been great speaking to you. Thanks, guys.